The courtroom is quiet as Kody Brown rises, because it is known that truth does not reside among quiet moments. It erupts. 4 wives, decades of secrets, and a case about to blow everything we think we know about the Brown family. Before we enter that courtroom and see this deceit that has shaken sister wives to its very foundations, you can count me out until the very finish, because by the time you finish the story, you could very well change your allegiance. The courthouse itself isn't dramatic looking. It's gray stone and glass, nothing too flashy, but there's something about the atmosphere in there that's almost palpable, like it's full of years of anger just waiting to be expressed today. The benches are full. There are no cameras, but everyone knows what's going to leave the courtroom today. It's more than a courtroom showdown. It's a family trying to put themselves on trial. Kody is sitting at the defense table with his jaw set and his eyes darting back and forth. He doesn't seem like the loud and confident father that everyone remembers from the TV show. He looks smaller, weary, cornered. Robyn is sitting next to him with her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles have turned white. Across from her, Christine holds her spine stiff, a tranquil demeanor bordering on deadly. This is not the same woman from the confessionals, weeping softly behind locked doors. This is a woman who has already crossed a starting line, completing a process begun the moment she walked out, and she's back for a finish. Janelle rests on her left, features set in a mask, although her toe anxiously tapped a soft beat on the floor, indicating she's holding far more back than plans to be shared. Meri was separate, uncertain where she fits, looking down, torn between 2 souls.
Enters the judge. All rise. The room quiets down, but the tension doesn't. It heightens. The case is easy to explain on paper. Financial misrepresentation, lack of emotional nurturing via contract fulfillment, assets representing multiple marriage contracts that were never honored via legality but were stringently enforced. However, this family has never made anything simple. Christine is the first to be summoned. She walks towards the stand. She walks slowly. She doesn't hurry. She makes no attempt to avoid eye contact. As she is sworn in, her voice is steady, almost unnaturally so. She begins speaking of the years that came before, the promises, the joint bank accounts, the knowledge that everything, money, time, and all things to do with feelings, would be divided rather equitably, and how they left all of it to Kody to lead and guide and protect. Then her tone shifts. Nights of waiting, canceled holidays, children asking why their dad had not arrived. She writes of rotation becoming a word that no longer meant anything, of Robyn's house always needing him, of family meetings becoming non-existent, of decision-making without collective consent. Kody changes positions in his seat. "You betrayed me," Christine says, not looking at him, but it's clear who she's referring to with betrayal. "You want me?" Christine says, her voice a challenge. "Here I am." But as Christine waits, it seems like the whole courtroom leans forward. This is where things start getting uncomfortable for. "The money," she says. "The family fund," she continues, where the profits from the show or the books or appearances all went into the same pot. She talks about watching the pool empty while explanations failed to materialize. Coyote Pass comes up, and suddenly the courtroom shrinks. "You say I stole from my sister?" She couldn't. "Did you at any time agree to an uneven allocation of the joint finances?" There's no pause in the response from, "No." Robyn's attorney objects. The judge overrules. "But I continued to stay in this relationship for many years," Christine continues. "And I remember when I came to terms with why I was staying in it, it didn't just seem like it wasn't working. It seemed like it was working for one family's benefit." She describes emotional abandonment, being told I'm unsafe for being emotional. Kody finally looks at her. Their eyes meet. Something flashes. Anger, regret, fear. It's a fleeting moment. Gone. And oh, just when you think Christine is done, she takes a breath. The kind of breath that means she is about to say something for the first time in her life. It was an honest conversation. It took place one night after filming. There were no cameras present, no producers hovering. She tells of Kody's revelations about his loss of belief in plural marriage as he knew it, about his belief that while their love was not equal, some of his sacrifices were worth it, while others were not. There is a murmur of. Robyn shakes her head. Tears are forming. Besides, Christine finishes cleanly. That's what I knew about myself. I wasn't a betrayer. That's when. She resigns. Janelle is up. But her testimony is different. There is less emotion, more precision. She speaks about numbers, papers, statements. She describes challenging expenses,
accused of being disloyal, of making a demand for transparency into a sin. She speaks about realizing she had no legal rights, there was no ownership, no security, despite all the contributions. And right when the stats become sounding boring, Janelle hurls off a statement that turns the room icy. I entrusted him with my future. Kody's attorney presents himself for cross-examination. He presses for information, hints at misunderstandings, implies consent by... Janelle does not raise her voice. Silence isn't consent when you're afraid to speak. It hits home like no yell could. Meri is the last person summoned for the day. She looks torn just walking to the stand. This is the same woman who waited after love left, who waited with hopes to be fulfilled. Her voice quivers, but then it steadies. She speaks of loneliness, of being legally divorced for the family, of watching the way in which relationships changed while I was stuck in place. Can you help me finish my homework?
She confesses that she knew there was something wrong with what was going on, but didn't speak out. The courtroom falls silent. And in the silence, one question lingers. What else did Meri know, and why does she choose to say this now? The judge declares a recess. Kody takes a breath for the first time all day. Robyn whispers something to him. Both Christine and Janelle turn and walk out of the room without looking back. But in stepping down, Meri pauses. Her eyes start to Kody. Not in anger, not in love, with something far more dangerous. Regret. And with the door shut on them, one reality is evident. This case is no longer about money. It's about who's going to retell the story and who is going to be heard. As for what will happen next, it won't merely determine this particular case, but also determine which secrets will live through this trial. The courtroom is different after the interlude, as if the air itself is different now that the polite version of the story is over. And when the whole group files back into the courtroom, you can feel it. This is the point at which everything stops being so carefully managed and everything starts being extremely personal. As Kody leads the way into the courtroom with his shoulders back and his jaw set, and his whole demeanor the demeanor of a man who knows he is being wronged, and not the man who is being put on trial for his deeds, while Robyn trails along right after him with tears shining in her eyes and a tissue clutched tightly in her hand, as if she knows she is going to break when the time comes, and she will go with nothing left but tears and vitriol for the documented crime that is Kody Brown, and that is going to be committed here and now, and that also needs no words for argument when the whole group trails into the courtroom together, with the side that is more divided now, even more so when she was with him, and Meri brings up the rear alone because she is still gripped by the thoughts that she could have said, and still needs the time that is rapidly running away for the words that would bomb over the courtroom like a blast bomb when the whole courtroom calls into order. And instead of kicking off with the wife this time, the case starts with the receipts and the timelines and the bank statements that appear magnified on the screen and suddenly seem far too large for the comfort level of Kody Brown. Because now this is not a battle for the soul. This is a battle for the proof that was provided, with the first wife being Janelle, because the testimony she gave is now making far more sense than words could ever explain, because the whole group had been supposed to contribute equally, and the whole group had been contributing equally until the pattern that is being revealed here when the screen lights up, with the wife's part being highlighted time and time again, because the whole courtroom is abuzz with the live current that runs through every single soul who is seated here, because this is the moment when the whole courtroom realizes that the case isn't anything about a broken heart.
Kody's lawyer protests, calls it deceiving, says that context is being withheld. And of course, that's allowed. But the end result is still catastrophic, because once you see inequality, you can't unsee it. And then, when Kody's lawyer asked Janelle to come back in and explain one specific transfer, a big one, from just a few months after Christine had mentally checked out of their marriage, Janelle doesn't bat an eye before talking about how she questioned it, how she asked for clarity, how she was told she was being negative, divisive, and unsupportive of their family vision, before adding, after a long pause, that asking questions made her feel like she was playing with fire. In other words, not physically, but mentally, because questions had consequences. And then suddenly, the whole room gets what's going on in terms of control, and what it may or may not look like. Kody gets a chance to testify, and the dynamic changes immediately, because that's who people remember. That guy who's animated and defensive and quick to point fingers somewhere else. And Kody launches directly into a monologue about what it's like living a plural marriage, that nobody appreciates what he was doing for his family, that they simply do not understand what he sacrificed for their relationship. Kody talks and his voice rises, but it rises not from confidence but from frustration, because for one reason or another, nobody in that room is believing what he's saying anymore. He insists that he did the best that he could, that he was just stretched thin, that favoritism was simply an angry ex-wife's myth,
and that Robyn is nodding and crying and agreeing with Kody, that even he knows that what he's saying simply isn't true, when one question from the prosecution delivers an out-of-body punch. Did you ever consider one household over another? Kody laughs hard and fast. Absolutely not. Then adds that you can't divide love like you divide a pie. And that's when Christine responds, small and sharp, simply a small shake of her head. And strangely, that's what hurts even more than a strong reaction. And just when Kody thinks that's been sufficiently covered, evidence shows in terms of a tape of his own voice from a close testimony, mere mumbles that some of their relationship, that some of their love does require or does demand more maintenance than other relationship.
The courtroom falls silent, and Kody's face changes, because you can't argue with yourself on tape. And Kody's attorney tries to spin it, says it was taken out of context, but context is no match for tone, and the tone is unmistakable. It's all about explanation, not apology. Robyn is next, and her testimony is laced with emotion from the opening word, the shake in her voice as she talks of being blamed, of being the recipient of hatred for loving Kody, of having never asked for anything more, having never asked to be the favored one. And for a moment, it works, and the courtroom leans in, until the prosecutor asks, gently, if she knew about the imbalance in the finances, and Robyn pauses, for a beat, but only a beat, before replying that Kody handled the finances, and the silence in the room becomes the loudest sound. She talks of the need in her household, of the younger children, the instability, but the sound at the back of the room is the sound of Janelle's face scrunching, because here is the same explanation the listener has been hearing now for years. But the prosecutor presses on, asking if Robyn had ever proposed a better allocation of funds, and the response is soft but deadly. That wasn't my role. It is in this moment the audience realizes something terrifyingly true. You don't have to make the imbalance, only accept the benefit. Meri is recalled, and the offering is different, because something has finally broken, because a door was opened, and Meri talks of the silence, because silence had lingered longer than it should, because the pressure to be loyal is stifling. But in the end, the price was erosion, because watching the family fall apart, knowing that all was well, stole away the last thing that was left of herself. When she says, "I regret I didn't say something sooner," the quality of the voice is truth, not posturing, and the look on Kody's face is the look of a man who has been unsettled, because the very last one, the last one to whom he could turn, has finally turned against him. The prosecution swings back around to intent, to patterns, to emotional abandonment that directly correlates to financial dominion. And as the day wears on, the room thickens with tension that doesn't sting anymore, but chokes, like everyone waiting with bated breath for what nobody wants to acknowledge out loud. And just when it seems like the trial has revealed all it's going to reveal, another witness is called. This one not one of the wives or Kody, but someone who'd worked in the shadows all along, someone who'd handled calendars and infrastructure and private conversations, someone who'd noticed the cracks long before anyone ever checked their Instagram posts. This witness begins to talk of canceled commitments, of last-minute switcheroos, of excuses that at every damn time benefit the same family unit. And when asked if these choices had ever been questioned within their own ranks, there is but one answer: yes, and all of it was immediately squashed. The judge sees that it's getting late and sends it home for the evening, but there isn't relief this time, no sense of respite, for all of them understand what's waiting just around the corner: accountability, and whether it had been neglect and maladministration and croppola control and all of it. As Kody gathers up his things and begins to pack up to go home for yet another night of testimony and accountability and anotherable questioning of all of it, he's clutched by Robyn desperately, urgently, while all around him, far enough away that he can't yet hear it, but unmistakably visible from his present position, every inch of collection known and named and present for all these decades lets that weight all suddenly just exhale. Meri hangs around for one final moment before taking her final farewell alike, but when her eyes lock with Kody's for one final farewell moment, before she too has to go home and wait for what judgment awaits her there too, there isn't anger, but merely finality, final words spoken and final words delivered, that can for all of them, by all of them, be considered utter done and final. It won't be about what for the next session.
It'll be about who gets punished for it. Mourning comes with greater reluctance on the third and penultimate trial session of its kind, and precisely as if the very notion of it watching and waiting with them all to be next gets swept by something that hangs heavy and full of sadness and grief within chests, and won't let go, and won't let go, and won't let go of all that's going to be next and next and next, when it all opens and opens and opens.
When at long last all of it comes back around and gathers once again inside that same old trial room, full of mirrors and truth and ghouls and unknown, 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 unknown. And all of it, all, and all of it, and all of it, comes back around and gathers inside that trial room, full of testimony and court cases, and all of it, 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 all of it, and all of it, and all of it, inside that room full of tripwires, and all of it, and all of it, all, and all of it, all, inside that room full of known, unknown, unknown. And Kody steps into the room with far less confidence than he once had, eyes cast down at the floor, as he is clearly dripping with uncertainty from head to toe, while Robyn is clearly running on fumes, with mascara staining her cheek from her obvious lack of rest, as her facade is already unraveling before anything is even said, while across from her is a determined-looking Christine, whose resolve is now unbreakable, as she is accompanied by Janelle, while Meri is someone on the verge of making a confession she has been considering for years. The judge brings the session to order, and the prosecution doesn't waste any time warming up, but instead opens with a statement that lands like a warning. This case, they say, is no longer about unequal outcomes, but unequal power, about who held it, who lost it, and who suffered quietly because speaking up came with consequences. The first witness of the day is unexpected, a former family counselor who worked with the Browns during their most fragile years.
As she takes the stand, the courtroom shifts again, because this isn't someone speculating from the outside. This is someone who was invited in when things were already breaking. She speaks calmly, professionally, explaining how sessions increasingly focused on one relationship while others were minimized, how concerns raised by certain wives were reframed as negativity or lack of commitment, and how over time the family dynamic shifted from collaborative to hierarchical. And when asked who sat at the top of that hierarchy, she pauses, choosing her words carefully, before answering that decision-making power became centralized, and everyone knows what that means. And right here, when a neutral voice confirms what the wives felt for years, the story stops being emotional and starts becoming undeniable. Kody's attorney jumps in, suggesting bias, suggesting the counselor relied too heavily on the wives' perspectives. But the counselor responds evenly, that her role was never to assign blame, only to observe patterns. And the pattern, she says, was consistent. When conflict arose, the solution always required the same people to compromise and the same people to be protected. Robyn wipes out her eyes, shaking her head, but the counselor doesn't look at her, doesn't accuse, doesn't soften. She simply states facts, and facts don't care who they hurt. Next up, the prosecution brings internal messages, texts and emails traded between Kody and wife relative, and the courtroom leans in, held mapped by the reading of excerpts from messages that show Kody characterizing concerns as drama, putting off discussions indefinitely, promising changes that never come. And while none of these messages is explosive on its own, altogether they weave into something much more damning, a pattern of avoidance and control stretching across years. Janelle is called back to the stand to contextualize one exchange in particular, a message in which she asked for a family meeting to discuss finances and received no response for weeks, until she finally did, a vague reassurance followed by nothing. And she explains how moments like that taught her that persistence would only yield punishment in the form of emotional distance, coldness, exclusion. And as she speaks, the courtroom falls silent in that specific way that happens when people recognize a truth they have themselves lived. And just when it feels like the emotional weight can't grow any heavier, Christine is asked a single question that shifts the room's temperature altogether. Did you ever feel afraid to speak? Christine hesitates, not because she doesn't know the answer, but saying it aloud makes it real. And when she finally nods and says yes, she explains it wasn't a fear of violence, but of erasure. Fear that saying pain would make her invisible, unlovable, disposable. And that admission hits harder than any accusation could, because it reframes the entire marriage not as chaotic, but as quietly coercive. Kody speaks then, unable to keep quiet, speaking urgently with his attorney, head shaking, boiling over in frustration. And when an opportunity for him to speak arises, he tumbles forth into a defense that sounds more desperate than it is convincing. Said he was pressured, leadership often had to make tough decisions, not everybody could be satisfied, and for one moment his words almost land,
because responsibility is messy and leadership is hard, until the prosecution asks him if leadership also requires accountability. Kody stops, and for a moment, something is different, because for the first time, he doesn't have an answer ready, and the silence stretches just long enough for doubt to settle in. And that silence speaks louder than all he said all week. Robyn is called again, and this time the tone is different, less sympathetic, more piercing, and she is asked directly whether she ever intervened on the occasions when she noticed an imbalance, whether she ever advocated for the other wives behind closed doors. And Robyn's voice cracks as she says she tried, that she encouraged communication, wanted harmony, but when pressed for specifics, date, actions, outcomes, her answer's circular, emotional, yet not concrete, and painful as it may be, the difference that separates intention from impact becomes clear as day. Meri's turn comes again, and something in her has flipped since yesterday, because instead of sounding unsure, she sounds determined, and she admits that loyalty made her complicit, that staying silent felt at that time like survival, but looking back, she realizes now how silence created harm. And as she says that sometimes she wishes she had spoken up sooner, not just for herself but for them, Christine shuts her eyes, not in anger, but in acknowledgement, like someone finally hearing an apology they didn't know they needed.
And just when it seems like the emotional peak has already passed, the prosecution introduces evidence again, tilting everything one last time: documentation showing that Kody was warned repeatedly about the emotional and financial consequences of his choices and elected not to change course. Courtroom feels smaller then, tighter, the walls inching in, and Kody's posture collapses just slightly, enough to notice if you're looking closely, because this isn't about misunderstanding anymore, it's about awareness followed by inaction, and that's a far harder thing to justify. The judge calls for another brief recess, and nobody moves right away because leaving feels too soon when so much is still in the air. And as people finally rise, whispers ripple through the room, speculation thick, tension unresolved. Side, Kody avoids eye contact entirely, Robyn clinging to him like an anchor, while Christine and Janelle stand in a cluster again, not celebrating, not gloating, just breathing a little easier. Meri lingers at the door, watching them with a mix of some relief and some grief, like someone mourning a version of herself that no longer exists. Because when the court resumes, the focus will shift from what was done to why it was allowed to continue, and that question has the power to change everything. The fourth session begins in a courtroom already thick with tension, the kind of setting that makes every creak of the floorboards echo louder than it should. As the doors open, you can feel the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on everyone inside, because today is no longer about recollection or proof. Today is about consequences, accountability, and emotional reckonings that have simmered for years. Kody walks in first, more rigid than before, jaw tight, hands clenching and unclenching as if he's trying to physically hold himself together. Robyn follows behind, her expression a mask of calm that barely conceals the storm inside. Christine and Janelle come in like soldiers returning to a battlefield they already know, faces unreadable, eyes sharp. Meri lingers a step behind, the hesitation in her walk betraying an inner conflict she's been wrestling with since day one. And the judge calls the court to order, the gavel striking like a heartbeat in the heavy room. Prosecution opens with a line that cuts through tension instantly, reminding the jury this isn't just about financial mismanagement or unequal distribution, but about patterns of emotional neglect and intentional favoritism that have affected children, spouses, and the whole family structure. As the first witness is called, a longtime friend of the family, a confidant who observed the inner dynamics for decades, the room instinctively seems to lean in, understanding the weight of a person who speaks without bias yet can't ignore the truth. The friend recounts observations of detailed holidays dominated by one household, children's birthdays postponed or ignored, emotional needs consistently deprioritized to maintain the comfort of one wife, and how Kody repeatedly justified those decisions by claiming family harmony, when in reality it meant consolidating power and attention into Robyn's household. As she speaks, murmurs ripple through the gallery, the kind of utterances that betray a mixture of disbelief and empathy, because hearing such particulars transforms suspicion into undeniable reality. Here, at once, when a trusted outside perspective ratifies what the wives had felt over the years, their emotional resonance becomes all but unbearable. Internal emails, private recordings, and documented conversations are introduced to the prosecution, not as part of some attempt at shock value, but to show consistency across time, and the room reacts to messages where Kody dismisses Christine's concerns as trivial, where Janelle's requests for transparency are ignored, and where Meri's patience and loyalty are taken for granted. The juxtaposition of his words versus his actions starts painting a portrait of deliberate emotional control, one that is subtle enough to avoid casual detection but in its persistence, damaging. Kody takes the stand and almost immediately is in full force with his defensive character, speaking quickly, emphasizing the sacrifices he made for the family, the pressures of leadership, the complexity of plural marriage, and while his words ring with conviction, his eyes belie fatigue, doubt, and the creeping realization that the narrative has slipped from his control. And when the prosecution asks him point-blank whether he considered an emotional cost for putting one household above the others, his answer is non-responsive, and it gets noted by the judge. It's a subtle moment but powerful. Perception in the jury's eye significantly shifts. Robyn follows, speaking with measured emotion, recounting her perspective of devotion and sacrifice, yet presses on if she noticed these imbalances or tried to intervene on behalf of the other wives. It brings a hesitation, and her studiously put-on calm cracks as she admits often deferring judgment to Kody. That perfectly illustrates passive complicity contributing to ongoing inequities. Christine's eyes flash briefly at this admission, a flicker of validation and pain intertwined. Janelle sits rigid, taking in the layers of truth surfacing that both confirm her experience and highlight her long-suppressed frustrations. Just when the courtroom gets settled into this rhythm of revelations, the prosecution suddenly shifts its focus to the children called to witness in a controlled, age-appropriate setting. The stakes suddenly feel immediate and raw. The voices of those affected by adult decisions hold a weight no document or testimony could replicate. Children speak of confusion, quiet tears, wondering why some parents seemed more present for others. The emotional honesty hits like a tidal wave. The artificial calm that Kody and Robyn have attempted to maintain is broken. It's even apparent on the jury members, who visibly lean further forward, transfixed, struggling in composure. Evidence of missed milestones, broken promises, and selective attention is laid bare. Kody shifts uncomfortably, attempting to justify, explain, or deflect, and every such attempt seems to tighten the noose, because the chasm between his narrative and the lived experiences of his wives and children grows ever sharper. Meri is called back to provide her account, and she speaks in a fragile but resolute tone, admitting that loyalty and fear of confrontation kept her silent for too long, that she allowed injustice to persist, and that the weight of knowing what was happening but not acting left her with guilt she could no longer ignore. As her words fill the room, Christine nods imperceptibly, a quiet acknowledgement of shared pain and courage, while Janelle's jaw tightens, eyes glinting with vindication tempered by sorrow. The session further intensifies when a surprise witness, a former household manager familiar with the family's finances and schedules, testifies that Kody was repeatedly made aware of inconsistencies and disparities, yet chose inaction or rationalization, which serves to further entrench a growing narrative of calculated neglect cloaked in appeals to leadership and responsibility. When asked if Kody ever responded to concerns in a manner that addressed issues of fairness, the witness answers flatly, "No." It's a simple word that lands like a hammer. In the silence, the courtroom seems to hold its collective breath because the most simple truths often speak the loudest. Kody's attorney tries to redirect, indicating pressures, intentions, and historical context, but each time the effort undercuts previously set patterns and corroborated testimonies to leave the defense on increasingly shaky ground. Robyn's final testimony of the day turns emotional and reasoned, as she talks about her commitment to Kody and family and inadvertently underlines the imbalance she benefited from and failed to rectify, showing how even love can blind one to inequities that harm others, as Christine and Janelle listen with a mixture of empathy and quiet fury. Meri follows up, still reflecting on confessions from earlier in the day, providing clarifying statements regarding the culture of silence in the family, unspoken rules in maintaining obedience, and how breaking that silence was both terrifying and necessary. She speaks as Kody looks increasingly isolated, the combination of factual evidence and emotional testimony eroding the narrative he has tried to maintain for decades. The prosecution closes the day reiterating accountability. Leadership, love, and influence have responsibility. Not naming or moving to right the imbalance carries real-life consequences, a declaration that weighs heavy in the air long after the gavel falls, which leaves such a charge of discomfort and suspense with the jurors, the families, and everyone else concerned. For as this session comes to a close, there is one thing that cannot be denied. The emotional and ethical stakes are higher than before, and the next day requires answers that no one is fully ready to give. The fifth session opens without noise and with a tension heavier than any day thus far, the type of stillness that presses down upon your chest and makes every step toward the courtroom feel like a journey into the midst of a storm. Entering, Kody ambles slower, shoulders slumped slightly, jaw tightly clenched, a man wholly aware that the narrative slipped long ago beyond his control. Robyn follows closely behind, her eyes cast down but her lips pressed firm, as if she readies herself for what she knows to be a confrontation that shall leave no one unscathed. Christine and Janelle walk in abreast, synchronized in intent, their eyes keen, movement deliberate, a mute pronouncement that they are no longer passive players in this drama but are forces to be acknowledged, while Meri trails after them, hesitant yet resolute, the quiet weight of years of withheld truths and compromised loyalty etched upon her features. The judge calls the court to order, the gavel strikes with a finality that sends the room shivering slightly, and the prosecution, without much ado, opens with a very pointed summary. This case has transcended mere finances and procedural missteps into the very heart of the family's emotional structure. As the first witness takes the stand, a private investigator who had been hired years prior to document internal disputes and behavioral patterns, the courtroom leans in collectively, aware that this testimony promises to give them the clarity no testimony hitherto has captured in full. And the investigator recalls with painstaking detail how Kody's decisions consistently favored one household, how efforts to raise concerns were met with obfuscation, delay, and emotional manipulation, and how even the children over time came to recognize the inequity, to internalize guilt, confusion, and a perverted sense of what fairness and loyalty are all about, all in the shadow of adults around them who justified inaction on the pretext of unity. Here, as an impartial observer corroborates the wives' accounts, the accumulated weight of evidence begins to feel unavoidable and devastating. The prosecution follows this up with a spate of private video diaries Christine and Janelle recorded over the years for personal catharsis and now produced as evidence, and the court watches in near silence as the footage unfolds details of private anguish, moments of vulnerability, and the quiet courage one needs to survive systemic neglect while putting up a united front, each confession layering new depth onto the already mounting tension. Kody shifts uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his temples, muttering under his breath, and Robyn sits frozen, seemingly caught between loyalty and disbelief. The defense attempts to redirect, framing the diaries as subjective, emotionally charged narratives. But even the defense cannot efface the authenticity, the rawness, and the repeated patterns emerging unmistakably from these recordings. Meri is called on to continue testimony that she has already given, speaking in a voice that's trembling at first, with each word growing stronger, admitting it was complicity she knew of inequities and allowed them to go on out of fear and hope and misplaced loyalty. As she describes the internal battle, emotion thickens the air, making the jurors lean forward instinctively, sympathizing with both the moral and psychological toll extracted from those who loved yet were powerless to effect change. When she speaks of the exact moment she knew her loyalty had become harm, there is a hush as if the courtroom, en masse, holds its collective breath in acknowledgement of a painful universal truth about the nature of complicity and courage. Just when it seems that this session is hitting emotional peaks, the prosecution pulls out financial records, logs, and contracts that not only show how repeated warnings fell by the wayside, requests for transparency were belittled, but also how patterns of preference weren't accidental, they were sustained and nurtured over decades. And such evidence weaves into a tapestry of intentful inattention there's no overlooking. Kody finally takes the stand for direct examination, visibly fatigued, his voice measured and defensive, citing the pressures of managing multiple households, attempting to justify past behaviors as necessary for the preservation of family. But as he's pressed on why certain requests were ignored or delayed, or why some homes received special attention on an emotional and financial level, the hesitation grows and the prosecution digs deep, pushing on inconsistencies and contradictions between what was intended and what impact was felt, turning what had begun as a defense into exposed systemic patterns. Robyn says that she follows through with the stresses of keeping her house and what she perceives as the necessity of deferring to Kody's judgment. However, when asked if she knew about disparities, her answers trace how passive acceptance allowed inequity to thrive. Her hands quiver just a little, and her voice quivers slightly as she answers, while Christine and Janelle watch with an expression both of validation and sorrow, acknowledging that experiences well known to them have been distorted by this culture that had taught silence and compliance. Attentions turn to specific incidents, Missed celebrations, delayed responses to emergencies, decisions that placed one household's needs above others time after time. And with each scenario laid bare, the emotional weight bears down more heavily, underlining not just the logistical mismanagement but deep, pervasive effects on familial relationships, trust, and self-worth. Meri continues, elaborating on how, over time, witnessing these patterns whittled away at her identity, forced her into moral compromise after compromise, and then left her questioning her guilt for not acting sooner. Her testimony is a portrait of quiet suffering that sharply contrasts with Kody's earlier assertions of sacrifice and leadership. And when she talks about the long-lasting emotional impact on the children, the courtroom absorbs the weight of generational impact. And in that instant that she speaks of the children, the air seems to constrict because the human cost is no longer conceptual. It is real, immediate, and devastating. Prosecution calls the family's former household manager, who in granular detail describes how Kody's decision-making consistently aggregated resources, time, support, and other forms of attention in a way that perpetuated inequality. He documents several instances where requests for fairness were summarily dismissed or put off until doomsday. And when asked if at any point corrective measures were initiated as a matter of course, the manager responds unequivocally, no, leaving an unmistakable record of conscious choices to perpetuate imbalance. Kody's attorney attempts to mitigate, citing the intricacy of plural marriage, the stresses of public scrutiny, and the inevitable missteps in managing multiple households. However, the repeated testimonies, personal diaries, and documented evidence weave an overwhelming narrative, one underlining, beyond mismanagement, a psychological and emotional toll on all parties involved and revealing a system in which personal accountability was consistently deferred. Robyn provides clarifying testimony, reflecting on her reliance on Kody's judgment, the tension between loyalty and fairness, and the personal cost of inaction. Her voice is tinged with regret as the jury and courtroom observers acknowledge the nuanced interplay of intention, action, and consequence. Christine and Janelle are commanding yet restrained, their expressions a mix of vindication, sorrow, and cautious hope as they witness Kody's increasingly isolated position within the courtroom, while Meri's quiet strength anchors the moral center of the proceedings, exemplifying the profound effects of prolonged silence and the courage it takes to finally speak truth. The session builds to its emotional peak as prosecution summarizes the revelations of the day, reinforcing themes of favoritism and neglect, the sustained emotional impact upon spouses and children alike, and highlighting specific windows when intervention might have prevented harm but was consciously or unconsciously avoided. And when the gavel falls for adjournment, the courtroom holds its collective breath, still thick with unresolved tension, the jurors burdened with the cumulative weight of testimony, evidence, and personal account, and all exit with the understanding that the narrative has irrevocably shifted, that the human stakes are clearer than ever, and that the next session will exact answers that will, perhaps, course-correct the family's future permanently. For as this session draws to a close, one fact has emerged as undeniable. This is no longer a trial about money or schedules or household logistics. It is a trial about conscience and accountability and the cost of choices for everyone involved.